Marlon Brando was the kind of man Hollywood wasn't prepared for. A face sculpted like it was carved out of light, a voice that could melt into a whisper and still fill the room, and a presence so magnetic that directors said the camera didn't just love him, it obeyed him to the world. Brando was the soft-spoken rebel, the sensitive artist, the troubled genius who reshaped acting forever. He was mystery wrapped in leather, a heartthrob who seemed almost too soulful for the industry he conquered, but that was the version fans were allowed to see. Behind the interviews, the charm, the quiet smirks, and the mythic roles, there existed another Marlon Brando, a man insiders barely dared to talk about. A man whose brilliance came with shadows so deep that even those closest to him struggled to separate the performance from the person. Actors who worked with him described two Brandos: the enchanting genius who could elevate any scene, and the unpredictable force who could destroy a relationship, a friendship, or an entire film set without hesitation. The public adored the first Brando. Hollywood survived the second one. This wasn't just a double life. It was a war he fought with himself every day. One moment he was gentle and thoughtful, quietly opening up about his childhood, or offering advice with surprising tenderness. In the next, he could become cold, distant, or brutally cruel, shutting down anyone who stepped too close. Some insiders said he could switch personalities the way he changed lines on a script. Instantly, effortlessly, and without warning. Directors whispered that his brilliance had a price. Lovers said the charm was only the first layer. Friends claimed they never truly knew who they were talking to. Hollywood built him into an icon, but the real Brando was someone the studios desperately hoped the public would never meet. Someone volatile, someone wounded, someone who could seduce a room and then burn every bridge on his way out of it. He wasn't just the charming rebel America fell in love with. He was a master illusionist, crafting a version of himself the world wanted to believe, a version so convincing that the real man slipped through the cracks and disappeared behind the legend he created. And here's the part few people ever knew. Behind closed doors, when the cameras stopped rolling and the spotlight faded, Brando wasn't the fearless rebel or the smoldering heartthrob. He was a man haunted by the ghosts he never outran, childhood scars he never healed, relationships he sabotaged without meaning to, and a fear of vulnerability so intense it pushed him deeper into the persona that made him famous. By the time the world realized how deeply the darkness had settled, it was already too late. The myth had replaced the man. In this video, we're going inside the life Brando hoped no one would uncover, not the Hollywood icon, the person behind him, the charming genius the world worshipped, and the private monster the insiders knew. And trust me, the real story is darker, stranger, and far more tragic than anyone ever imagined. Long before Marlon Brando became Hollywood's most unpredictable genius, he was just a quiet boy growing up in Omaha, Nebraska, a place that looked peaceful from the outside but felt like a storm on the inside. His childhood home wasn't filled with warmth or stability. Instead, it was a place where emotions were unpredictable and affection was inconsistent, and that was the first world he learned to survive. His mother, Dodie Brando, was a talented woman trapped in a life she didn't want. She drank heavily, drifting in and out of the family like a ghost. Some days she was affectionate, funny, and full of life. Other days she disappeared emotionally, leaving Marlon and his siblings to fend for themselves. Brando loved her deeply, but he grew up never knowing which version of her he'd wake up to. That uncertainty carved something permanent into him. A fear of being abandoned and an instinct to hide his real feelings before someone could weaponize them. His father, on the other hand, was the complete opposite. Brutally strict, emotionally distant, and unimpressed by anything Marlon did. He criticized his son constantly, calling him soft, lazy, or weak. Instead of building Marlon up, he chipped away at him piece by piece. And for a boy who desperately wanted approval, that kind of detachment felt like a wound that never healed. This was the environment where Brando learned his first survival trick. If people can hurt you, don't let them see who you really are. That single idea would define the rest of his life. Teachers noticed something strange about him even as a kid. He didn't just pretend to be someone else. He became someone else. One moment he could play the shy, quiet boy who followed every rule. The next, he turned into a rebellious clown, cracking jokes, mocking authority, and winning the room. His ability to shift personalities wasn't just a talent, it was his shield. He learned early that charm could disarm anyone. It could soften a teacher. It could distract a parent. It could hide the pain he didn't know how to express. And behind the charm was a growing darkness, a mix of anger, fear, and frustration he didn't know how to control. When his mother disappeared into another drinking episode, or his father dismissed him with a cold stare, that darkness grew stronger, sharper, more unpredictable. By his teens, Brando was already living two lives. At school, he was charismatic, funny, and strangely irresistible. Students gravitated toward him because he felt alive in a way most people weren't. He could imitate anyone, flip accents like a switch, and charm a room without even trying. But at home, he was withdrawn, tense, and volatile. He tore through rules, broke boundaries, and pushed against anything that felt restrictive. He wasn't rebelling for attention, he was rebelling for survival. People who knew him back then said you could never tell which Marlon you were going to get. The sweet, sensitive boy who listened quietly. Or the explosive kid who would slam doors, shout back, or disappear for hours. This was the beginning of the Brando duality. The very thing that would later make him legendary on screen and impossible to handle off it. Even before Hollywood, even before fame, the pattern had already formed. He could charm anyone. He could fool everyone, but he couldn't escape the damage he was carrying. And as he grew older, the world around him would only magnify both sides of his personality, the genius and the chaos, until they became inseparable. Because the truth is, Hollywood didn't create Brando's double life. It merely gave him the stage to hide it. Brando's arrival in New York was like a storm. He wasn't just talented, he was magnetic. Casting directors and acting coaches watched in awe as this young man, barely out of his teens, transformed every room he entered. Some called it raw genius. Others whispered it was almost unnatural, the kind of charisma that could charm strangers and disarm enemies in the same breath. Soon, the theater world took notice. Brando wasn't just acting, he was redefining what it meant to perform. His energy was electric. He could make you laugh one moment, leave you breathless the next. Critics marveled at his presence, describing it as untouchable, mesmerizing, even dangerous in the best way. It was no surprise when Hollywood came calling. When Brando stepped onto the Hollywood scene, it was as if the industry collectively fell in love. Directors lined up for a chance to work with him. Leading ladies swooned. Studio executives offered contracts with practically no audition. To the world, he seemed perfect, handsome, polite, intelligent, and humble. But behind the glimmering image, a very different Brando was emerging. Affairs began almost immediately. Older actresses, influential figures, he flirted and seduced with an ease that left people both enchanted and unsettled. It wasn't just charm, it was power. And power, Brando quickly learned, could be intoxicating. But his magnetism came with a shadow. Colleagues began noticing his unpredictable moods. One day he would be warm and engaging, the next cold and dismissive, leaving everyone around him confused and off balance. Friendships were fragile, loyalties fleeting. Brando wanted admiration more than connection, praise more than companionship. And beneath it all, a pattern was quietly forming. A pattern that would define his life. He craved attention and power, but intimacy terrified him. The young actor who could make the world fall at his feet was the same one who would push away anyone who got too close. This duality, charming and cruel, magnetic and volatile, was just beginning to surface, and those closest to him would soon learn that the man they adored in public could be impossible in private. Brando's rise wasn't just a career trajectory, It was the first stage in a lifelong dance between brilliance and chaos. Hollywood adored the face he presented to the world, but it was only a glimpse. The real Brando was still hiding in the shadows, waiting for the world to catch up, or perhaps to fear him. Brando's arrival in Hollywood wasn't just the beginning of stardom, it was the birth of a legend. By the time A Streetcar Named Desire hit the stage and later the screen, critics and audiences alike were captivated. Brando wasn't simply acting, he was embodying life itself, making the audience feel every ache, every desire, every unspoken thought. Directors called him a genius. Co-stars were in awe. To watch Brando was to witness a force of nature, but as public adoration grew, so did the volatility beneath the surface. What the audience saw, the mesmerizing, soulful actor, was only one side of Brando. Backstage, he was often unpredictable, temperamental, even cruel. On the set of On the Waterfront, stories abound of his mercurial nature. One day, he would deliver a performance so breathtaking, it silenced the crew. The next, he might sabotage a scene because of a minor perceived slight or act out against a co-star he deemed unworthy of his talent. Some claim he even intentionally improvised lines to unsettle others, keeping them off balance, reminding them, and perhaps himself, that he controlled the narrative, both on and off the screen. Co-stars learned quickly that Brando could charm and terrify within minutes. He could treat someone with warmth and intimacy, then, in the next scene or the next hour, dismiss them entirely. Directors walked a tightrope, constantly calculating how to manage his genius without triggering an emotional storm. This duality, brilliance on camera, chaos off it, became his defining characteristic. It was as though the very intensity that allowed him to create unforgettable performances also fueled his darker impulses. In public, he was a star. Privately, he was unpredictable, mercurial, and at times impossible to reach. Some of his closest collaborators noticed a pattern emerging. The more admired he became, the more volatile he grew. Success didn't tame him. It amplified his mood swings, his insecurities, and his capacity for manipulation. Those who worked with him learned to expect the unexpected, even as awards and accolades poured in. Brando's personal life teetered on the edge of chaos. Friendships were strained, romances unstable, and trust was scarce. The brilliance that earned him worldwide acclaim was inseparable from the instability that haunted his private life. By this point, it was clear. Marlon Brando had become a living paradox. The world celebrated him for his genius, but those who knew him intimately had already begun to glimpse the shadows behind the lights. The method acting era wasn't just a period of cinematic greatness, it was the stage where Brando's brilliance and his chaos collided, laying the foundation for a life that would enthrall, terrify, and confound everyone around him. If Brando's talent drew the world in, his personal magnetism had an almost dangerous pull. He wasn't just attractive, he was intoxicating. People didn't just meet him, they were swept into his orbit, often without realizing it until it was too late. Lovers described him as mesmerizing, electric, the kind of presence that made time feel irrelevant. But beneath the charm, there was a strategy. Brando used seduction as a tool, a way to assert control over the people who drew close to him. Affairs were not merely flirtations. They were calculated, emotional transactions. He would draw someone in with passion, make them feel uniquely seen, then withdraw, leaving confusion, longing, and sometimes heartbreak. Rumors swirled about both men and women in Brando's life. The details were often whispered rather than openly discussed. Some say he thrived on the thrill of conquest. Others suggest he sought intimacy, but was terrified of it at the same time. The truth may have been both. Brando craved closeness, yet ran from the vulnerability that came with it. Many of his partners recounted the same paradox. In one moment, he could be tender, funny, and disarmingly sincere. The next, he was distant, cold, even cruel, leaving them questioning everything they thought they knew about him. The emotional roller coaster wasn't just exhausting, it was a pattern. Brando's genius extended beyond acting. He had learned to read people, to sense their weaknesses and desires, and to use them to his advantage. And the heartbreak didn't stop there. Brando would disappear for days without explanation, leave lovers with unanswered questions, or manipulate emotions to maintain a sense of power. He wasn't just a man with affairs. He was a master of emotional influence. The thrill he offered was addictive, but the consequences were real and painful for anyone who became entangled with him. This was the side of Brando Hollywood rarely saw. The public marveled at his charm, his smoldering presence, his brilliance. Behind closed doors, he was volatile, unpredictable, and capable of leaving a trail of emotional devastation. Those closest to him weren't just participants in his life. They were caught in a web of intensity and manipulation that few could navigate. By now, a pattern was unmistakable. Passion, control, withdrawal, repeat. Brando's relationships mirrored his career. He was brilliant when he wanted to be, destructive when he needed to assert power, and mesmerizing throughout it all. The very traits that made him legendary on screen were the same that made him a dangerous force in private life. A man whose magnetism could enthrall, but whose darkness could wound. By the mid-1950s and early 1960s, Marlon Brando wasn't just a star, he was a phenomenon. He had achieved what few actors could even dream of: the adoration of the public, the envy of his peers, and the power to shape Hollywood itself. Contracts were no longer offered. Studios begged him to take roles. Directors walked on eggshells, careful not to trigger his temper. Producers trembled at the thought of disappointing him. Brando had become more than an actor. He was an institution, and his ego had grown with it. But with power came volatility. Brando wasn't just asserting his artistic vision, he was asserting himself as the ultimate authority. He rejected scripts he found beneath him, clashed with directors over creative decisions, and openly humiliated producers who challenged him. On some sets, even seasoned crew members reported feeling like strangers in his presence. No one could predict his moods, and those who tried often found themselves on the receiving end of a sharp tongue, or worse, behind the scenes, darker behaviors emerged. Emotional cruelty became a weapon. Co-stars recounted scenes of sudden anger, where Brando would berate someone for a minor mistake, only to charm them the next day as if nothing had happened. Weeks of preparation could be destroyed by an impulsive decision. And when the world wasn't watching, Brando retreated into indulgence. Gambling, overindulgent eating, late-night parties, and a growing paranoia that the very people around him were conspiring against him. His personal life mirrored the chaos of his professional one. Relationships were strained, and the people closest to him struggled to navigate a man who could be dazzling one moment and terrifying the next. Friends and colleagues spoke of an almost gravitational pull to Brando's charisma, but also a sense of danger, emotional, psychological, sometimes unbearable, yet paradoxically, this volatility only added to his mystique. Hollywood wasn't just watching an actor, they were witnessing a force of nature. His brilliance on screen became inseparable from his unpredictability off it. Studios tolerated outbursts because the results were extraordinary. Directors excused cruelty because it seemed to fuel his genius. And Brando himself seemed to thrive on this tension, as if the more volatile he became, the more indispensable he was to the industry that feared and revered him simultaneously. At the height of his fame, Brando's ego was no longer just a personal trait. It had become a force that influenced entire productions, dictated schedules, and even shaped the careers of those around him. His life had become a delicate balance between admiration and fear, genius and chaos, charm and cruelty. And while the world admired the results, few truly understood the cost of keeping up with a man who was as brilliant as he was uncontrollable. By the late 1960s, the man who had once electrified Hollywood had begun to retreat into himself. Brando's brilliance remained undeniable, but the chaos that had always lurked beneath the surface was now consuming him. Friends noticed the changes first. He gained weight, lost discipline, and grew increasingly paranoid. The charming, magnetic actor the world adored became a shadow of his former self, someone almost unrecognizable. He began withdrawing from the people who cared for him. Parties, premieres, Even casual social gatherings became unbearable. Brando preferred the solitude of his home, often disappearing for days, weeks, sometimes longer. His moods dictated his actions, and no one could predict what might trigger a storm of rage or sudden withdrawal. Directors and producers once feared his temper. Now, even friends feared the emotional cost of being near him. Family relationships suffered profoundly. Estranged children, broken marriages, and friendships severed by his volatility painted a picture of a man increasingly isolated from the world he had once conquered. Brando replaced genuine connection with indulgence, surrounding himself with chaos, distractions, and sometimes dangerous influences. Emotional stability became a foreign concept. Reports from insiders describe an almost terrifying duality. On one hand, Brando could be thoughtful, generous, even disarmingly kind. On the other, he could be cruel, manipulative, and merciless in his emotional interactions. Those who lived closest to him often described the experience as walking on a tightrope, never knowing if a single word or glance might unleash a storm. His reclusiveness intensified his paranoia. He suspected betrayal where there was none, imagined conspiracies in the shadows of his own mind, and isolated himself further, creating a feedback loop that only deepened his darkness. The people around him weren't just frustrated, they were afraid, not of physical harm, but of the emotional toll of being in the orbit of a man whose genius had become inseparable from his chaos. By this stage of his life, Brando's transformation was complete. The star, the genius, the magnetic force that had once captivated the world had become a man dominated by his own rage, isolation, and self-destructive tendencies. The very traits that had made him a legend, his intensity, his unpredictability, his refusal to conform, had now turned inward, consuming him and leaving those closest to him to navigate the wreckage. Brando had become a monster, not in the sense of violence, but in the sense of emotional gravity. His presence could intoxicate or devastate, his absence could relieve or wound. The world continued to admire him from afar, but the people who truly knew him understood the terrifying cost of that genius. By the 1970s, the world was starting to see cracks in the legend. Marlon Brando, once Hollywood's untouchable genius, was becoming known as unpredictable, difficult, and in some eyes impossible to work with. The same intensity that had propelled him to superstardom was now alienating the very industry that had once adored him. Directors who had once worshipped his talent now tread carefully, fearing emotional outbursts or sudden refusals to appear on set. Producers labeled him a nightmare, not because of incompetence, but because of the sheer volatility of his presence. Brando's moods could cancel weeks of work, derail multi-million-dollar productions, and frustrate even the most seasoned Hollywood veterans. The roles he once commanded were slipping away. Studios hesitated to hire him. Young actors who idolized him saw a cautionary tale. Brando had become a living paradox. The world wanted his brilliance, but few wanted the storm that came with it. Even when he returned triumphantly for The Godfather, it was a brief reprieve. The performance reminded the world why he had been legendary, but it also highlighted a pattern. After moments of brilliance came unpredictability behind the scenes. Stories persisted of mood swings, arguments with directors, and erratic behavior that threatened the smooth running of productions. The public narrative began to shift. Brando was no longer just a genius, he was a difficult star. Magazine articles speculated, sometimes sensationally, about his behavior, but insiders knew the truth. Brando's collapse wasn't about vanity or ego alone. It was about a man trapped by his own brilliance, consumed by personal demons, and unable to reconcile the public idol with the private chaos. As roles disappeared and his reputation grew more complicated, Brando's life became a balancing act between legend and implosion. Studios wanted the magic he produced on screen, but feared the emotional and financial cost of working with him. Directors who had once sought him out now approached him cautiously, negotiating every line, every scene, every moment, as though dealing with a force of nature. By the end of this era, Hollywood had witnessed a legend unravel. Brando remained brilliant, magnetic, and unforgettable on screen. But the man off camera had become increasingly unrecognizable. The public admired the work, the industry endured the storm, and those who knew him intimately, they were left to navigate the wreckage of a man who had once had the world at his feet, only to watch it slip away through a combination of ego, volatility, and self-destruction. In the later decades of his life, Marlon Brando had fully retreated from the public eye. The dazzling, magnetic star that once dominated Hollywood had become a recluse, a man surrounded by silence, guilt, and unresolved trauma. His brilliance was still evident in rare performances, but the volatility, the chaos, and the emotional scars had hardened into a permanent presence. Family tragedies and personal losses weighed heavily on him. Estranged children, broken relationships, and the ghosts of past decisions haunted his private world. Those closest to him describe a man living in the shadow of his own genius, tormented by the tension between the idolized figure the world adored and the flawed human he knew himself to be. Insiders, friends, co-stars, and those who survived the storm of his personality reveal a haunting duality. Brando could still be charming, witty, and generous. He could offer glimpses of warmth and vulnerability that reminded people why they had loved him in the first place. But that same man could also be manipulative, emotionally distant, and almost impossibly unpredictable one day. He might confide in someone, the next, he would retreat entirely, leaving confusion and pain behind. In these final years, Brando seemed to wrestle with his own contradictions. His genius, the very thing that had brought him fame, admiration, and wealth, had also been his undoing. The public remembered him as a legend, a pioneer, an actor who changed the craft forever. But the people who lived closest to him remember something else, a man who could charm and devastate in equal measure, whose brilliance was inseparable from his chaos. Perhaps the most haunting truth is this: the world admired Marlon Brando's genius, but few understood the price it demanded. Not just from him, but from everyone who entered his orbit. His life became a study in duality, a remarkable artist capable of sublime beauty, yet a man trapped by his own emotional turbulence. And so, as we look back on the life of Marlon Brando, we are left with a question that lingers long after the applause fades. Was the genius worth the cost? The films remain, the legend endures, but the human consequences, the heartbreak, the fear, the isolation, are reminders that behind every great talent, there may be a man few will ever truly know. Marlon Brando was captivating. He was destructive. A man who mastered illusion but ultimately lost himself behind it. The world saw a genius, an icon, a Hollywood legend. But those closest to him lived with the consequences of the man behind the myth. His life reminds us that brilliance often comes at a cost, and sometimes the price is paid by everyone around the genius, not just the genius themselves. If you found Brando's story as fascinating and as haunting as we did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the lives of Hollywood's most enigmatic legends. And we want to hear from you. Do you think Brando's genius justified the chaos he left behind? Or was it too high a price for those around him? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We'll be reading and discussing them in our next video. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you don't miss our next exploration of Hollywood's dark and mysterious side.